This week on Quadriga, 2011, year of crisis, year of hope. The events of 2011 have made headlines around the world and shaped the course of history. The EU is facing what's arguably the most serious crisis it's known, and no one can say for sure whether the Eurozone will survive. The nuclear disaster in Fukushima led Germany to transform its energy policy, setting itself apart from other industrialized nations. And in North Africa and the Middle East, popular revolts swept oppressive regimes from power, demanding freedom, democracy, and human rights. Your host this week is Terry Martin.
Hello and welcome. 2011 was indeed a very eventful year, providing plenty for us to talk about here on Quadriga. This week on Quadriga, we're going to take a look back at some of the key developments of over the past 12 months, stories that are likely to continue shaping our lives in the year ahead.
Joining Terry Martin in the studio, Samir Saeed is a freelance journalist and consultant working for a variety of Arabic and English language media outlets. Much of his work focuses on building bridges between Europe and the Arab world. Ulrike Herrmann writes about economic policy and social affairs for the German daily Die Tageszeitung, better known as the Taz. She's written extensively about the European debt crisis and its impact on society. Nicholas Kulisch is the Berlin bureau chief for the New York Times. He's also worked in Asia and the Middle East and covered the invasion of Iraq for the Wall Street Journal.
Now, there are lots of events in 2011 that we could talk about, but we have to prioritize given the fact that we only have half an hour. So we're going to focus on three: the European debt crisis, the Fukushima nuclear disaster, and the Arab Spring. I want to look at what the significance of these events are for the year and how they might affect us in the year ahead. Let's start with what seems like the never-ending crisis. Let's call it the European sovereign debt trauma. Ulrike, is this just a glitch in Europe's development, or does this have the potential to change Europe as we know it?
No, I think it's a decisive turning point. For one thing, it is a question whether the euro will survive the next year. Either, I think the European Central Bank will decide to become a normal central bank that it is allowed to buy up bonds issued by Eurostates, or the whole Eurozone will fail. And the other very important thing about the euro crisis is that it moved Europe together. I mean, it is really a very deep crisis, but the positive thing is that for the first time being, all these Euro governments were really forced to work together. I mean, they are meeting every week now and apparently telephone every day. So in a way, it is also a positive development.
So, well, they're not all moving in the same direction. We have to point out that Britain, at least, seems to be heading in a different direction. It's not clear what's going to happen there. But at a fundamental level, this was the big question when the crisis began. Will this bring Europe ultimately closer together towards a closer fiscal, perhaps closer political union? You believe it will? At
least the Eurozone. I mean, it's true that we have a Europe of two different Speeds, yeah. I mean, and that was somehow clear when the euro was founded, that it would make a difference whether you belong to the euro or not. And this becomes even more clear now.
Okay, so at least one group of countries within the European Union are moving closer together. Nicholas, I'd like to get your perspective, or I'd like to get actually the American perspective on this, because this is a subject in transatlantic relations. President Barack Obama has made several comments on Europe's handling of the European debt crisis. We're hearing from a number of people within the Senate and House of Representatives also commenting very outspokenly. How do Americans view Europe in the way it's handling the European debt crisis, not just Germany, but Europe as a whole? Do they think that Europe is wimpy for not throwing more money at this problem?
I think you could build the famous transatlantic bridge you could now build out of pointing fingers, because the Germans love to blame the Americans for the mortgage crisis, and they can't handle the debt ceiling, and the Americans love to say that the Europeans haven't fixed their banks and that they've allowed a political mess to turn into a sovereign debt crisis. I think it is clear that the United States has a recovery going and has a presidential election coming up, and therefore the sitting president would prefer that no significant financial collapses happen in the next, I guess it's 11 months. And so they've really been encouraging the Europeans to sort of follow their example. I think that
their example being what?
Their example being to we like to say unleash the central bank to do more to increase the money supply to try to jolt growth. Also, I mean, I think that a little more, the United States was actually more
debt is what you're talking about.
More debt, but also, I mean, more inflation is something else. I mean, look, you have 49% youth unemployment in Spain. People talk about the Eurozone holding together, but will the Spains and the Greeces really be able to put up with that? You have on the fringe, you have Hungary sliding toward authoritarianism and the European Union doing practically nothing because it's just focused on its currency. I mean, I think this is a continent that has a lot of issues that it has to work out.
We're looking in the United States an election campaign right now. We don't really know what's going to come out of that election for sure, even though the Republicans seem to be slightly in disarray. What would the U.S., on both sides of the aisle, the political aisle in Washington, like to see Europe do right now to deal with this crisis?
I don't think that anyone in America would have anything against Germany announcing a Eurobond plan and the European Central Bank announcing that it was going to set a ceiling on interest rates for Italy. Obviously, the German taxpayers, as we here in Germany know all too well, does have a great deal against that. But, it's easy to tell other people what to do with their money and what kind of guarantees to make. I think on the one hand that it's fair for Germany to want to set certain rules before agreeing permanently to pay the debts of other countries. But there's a certain point at which the reality of this common currency will have to be recognized.
Okay, Samir, let's look at this from a different perspective. The European debt crisis has occupied European countries, I mean, all 27 members of the European Union and peripheral countries as well. They're looking at the European debt crisis, very much focused on that, while events in the rest of the world are continuing to turn. Is there a sense, at least from Egypt, for example? I know you're very much involved in building bridges between Europe and the Arab world. From the Arab world's perspective, is Europe too concerned with its own problems? Is it being distracted from other, perhaps ultimately more important priorities?
In fact, there have been always ideas and opinions that Europe is too much involved, much more. Sometimes
too much involved with
the Arab region in terms of interference.
Interventionist.
Of course, yeah.
Okay.
You find both sides, but I'd like also to comment on the. If it is a really turning point, and I heard here the possibility of failing Eurozone or the whole currency or collapse, I think it's a bit too much exaggeration. I think, as you already said, the development is positive. The problem with the European zone that it started with having one currency without having a whole central monetary and fiscal system. And this is, I look at it as a corrective action. It is not as something that can make the whole system fail. The Eurozone and the European Union is still very young. And if we think about the whole world, there is no such a model. For example, he was suggesting that Europe should follow the American model. There is no such a thing that fits with the European Union and America. It's completely two different systems and with too many internal factors and complications. So I think I'm optimistic, and I think the European Union and Eurozone will survive it. And we don't have to forget that the price that Germany pays, many Germans are not happy with it because they pay a lot of money into this. But the political gain is also not well recognized I think this one has to also consider.
Okay, a final word before we move on to the next topic on the European debt crisis. Ulrike, if you look ahead to 2012, imagine us sitting in the same studio at the end of 2012, looking back, what will we be saying about the European debt crisis? Will we have found the silver lining?
Well, one thing is for sure, in 2012, the Eurozone will be heading towards a very severe recession. So the debts will increase instead of being reduced. And this recession will really be the point where the Eurozone has to decide on how to react and how to move on. And I think that you are right to be optimistic about the Eurozone somehow being kept together. But the question, for example, is whether Greece will still be within the Eurozone. I think that is an open question that is not possible to somehow forecast how that is going to be answered.
We'll be looking back again, I'm sure, a year from now, talking about this. Still a lot to be resolved there. Okay, but we do have to move on. Here in Germany, the European debt crisis seems somehow kind of abstract. Of course, it's very different for the people living in Greece and Spain and Italy. Paradoxically, the tsunami that struck Japan in March and caused the disaster, the nuclear disaster at the Fukushima plant, was very concrete, was felt very concretely here in Germany. It kept us all on the edge of our seats, and the impact of the Fukushima nuclear disaster here in Germany politically was enormous.
On March the 11th, a tsunami slammed into the east coast of Japan. The Fukushima nuclear power plant exploded, spreading radiation over land and sea. The political impact of the disaster was felt 11,000 kilometers to the west. Chancellor Angela Merkel decided to fast-track the phase-out of nuclear power in Germany. She said Fukushima led her to change her position on nuclear energy. The government declared that within 11 years, Germany will become the world's first major industrialized country free of nuclear power.
First major industrialized country without nuclear power. I remember Angela Merkel being at a G8 summit a couple of years ago, and she was almost laughed at for having a country that wasn't going to crank up its nuclear plants in order to get CO2 emissions down. Now it's a completely different situation. I want to start with you, Nicholas. Was this a politically astute move on behalf of Chancellor Merkel to react to the Fukushima nuclear disaster by pulling the plug on nuclear power faster than originally planned?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you can see that there was a lot of discussion of the election in Baden-Württemberg, and if her goal was to shore up the party there, then she absolutely did not succeed.
It happened right before that election in Baden-Württemberg.
Yeah, that was unfortunate. Yeah.
Exactly, and I think that I mean, it's very unusual. I mean, you see, but it reflects the German will in a way. I mean, the Germans have reacted more to the Fukushima crisis, I think, in terms of their attitude toward nuclear energy and nuclear policy than the Japanese have, and so I think that all that you really saw was finally an event that triggered a policy that reflected sort of the German democratic opinion.
Economically, a bad choice too?
Well, I think that there will be a lot of short-term costs. I think that without a deadline, nothing happens. I mean, when everybody's done it in their own life, whether it comes to whether it's a CEO or a child cleaning up their room, and so at this point, I think that with German engineers and power plant managers, putting their minds to it, they will get farther than they would have without the deadline. And so, in that sense, I think if one believes that this was a change that eventually was going to have to happen, then better to be on the cutting edge than to be one of the laggards.
Samir Said, how does it look from your perspective when Germany suddenly decides, oh, there's been a disaster in Japan, we're now going to radically change our energy policy and pull the plug on nuclear power faster than we intended? Does this look like German political dealings are being driven by ideology, environmental ideology in this case?
I actually disagree with this sudden. There were any sudden thing. It was the German society is very environmental, and I think before Merkel changed the already planned from Schroeder time a schedule to turn off the nuclear energy in Germany. So it has a history. So Fukushima played only, it proceeded as some kind of pressure on Merkel. And not only Merkel, also we have Westerwelle, we have also a group of politicians here in Germany. They think more economic. As you mentioned, of course, nuclear power has some economic advantages. And they can only see numbers. Some people, they can only deal with quantitative data. But qualitative data, they don't really consider. I mean, how can you measure environmental qualities, air qualities? They don't think of it this way. And I think Fukushima played a very good role in supporting people who are environmentally aware, and the risk, as we can also, it's not only in Japan. I remember there have been different nuclear accidents in Germany in the 80s and in the 70s. It is clear that nuclear energy is risky and can never be 100% secure. So if some people are willing to pay the high price of such risk just for economic gain, I'm not rich, but I don't have any problem to pay more for energy and being sure that I'm not risking not only my generation, but the generation of my kids, the generation of my grandchildren.
It's very controversial. This is the way many people were indeed arguing at the time here in Germany, too, surrounding the decision. There was a great deal of discussion. Things obviously look very different in hindsight. We just had the UN climate conference in Durban. Europe came away there with a very distinct profile, driven partly by Germany's decision on nuclear power. Ulrike Herrmann, how do you view this decision that Germany has taken? Is this ultimately going to raise Germany's profile among its peers in the international environment?
Well, I think it was a good decision to get out of the nuclear power. And of course, in the long run, I think it will open up new markets for Germany. I mean, it's something very obvious. Germany earns a lot of money with ecological industrial products, and this market will become more important in the long run. That's obvious. And for Germany, it's good to be at the head of the movement.
Politically, for Chancellor Merkel and her government, did this in the end help it or hurt it? I mean, obviously there was the casualty of Baden-Württemberg, which was a bit unfortunate, I guess, for the conservative-led government of that nuclear state. But at a national level,
yeah, but in the long run, it will help the party because, just as Mr. Said said, there is a very strong and very stable majority among the German voters against nuclear power. If you do not react as a party to this very strong majority, you do not stand a chance to win any election. It's really more a question of profile. It's true they didn't win the local election or the regional election in Baden-Württemberg, but it was really the question of having a chance as a party in the long run. And I think it was really very clever of Mrs. Merkel to switch off.
To admit also.
And to switch off 8 nuclear power plants with one stroke.
It has to be said, of course, that the decision had already been made to pull the plug on Germany's nuclear power plants even before Merkel came into government. It was just a question of how fast this should happen, and she decided to accelerate it. So that is definitely going to happen. We've got to moving right along to our constant companion of the year 2011, if you will, aside from the European debt crisis, and that was indeed the Arab Spring, if you will, the revolutions that swept through North Africa and the Middle East. This was all set in motion at the end of 2010 by a young man in Tunisia who frustrated by unemployment and the prospects of his future, doused himself with gasoline, set himself on fire in protest. Now, this made headlines throughout the Arab world, also around the entire world, but it set in motion a chain of events that affected not only Tunisia, but other countries as well. It inspired other countries to follow Tunisia's example of taking to the streets.
Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Libya, Syria. In the space of just a few weeks, protesters took to the streets in similar fashion in all of these countries. But in each case, the revolution unfolded differently. In Tunisia, voters elected a moderate Islamist government following the departure of President Ben Ali. In Libya, NATO intervened in the conflict and helped the rebels with airstrikes. Muammar Gaddafi was killed by rebel fighters. In Syria, President Assad has brutally repressed the demonstrations and continues to do so, ignoring international protests. In Egypt, the military took the reins of power from the deposed President Hosni Mubarak. Parliamentary elections have been dominated by Islamist parties.
And Nicholas Kulish, you were in Egypt tracking this story, the developments there. Do you have a sense that the people in the Arab world who participated in these revolutions are satisfied with the way things have developed? Have they gotten what they were expecting? Have they achieved what they were hoping for?
Well, I think it depends on who you ask and where you're asking the question. I mean, I think that, you know, in Egypt, very much the jury is still out on what's going to happen. I mean, we've seen more than a dozen people killed since Friday, and you know, you see a certain I guess hesitance on the part of the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamists to get involved at the moment, because they're hoping that their more than 2/3 combined majority in the parliament will stand. And so I think that, you know, looking at Egypt, which I can speak the most to, you see that you know, a lot of people felt that they had gained a great deal in terms of their freedom of speech, the way that the air that they breathed, you know, seemed freer. But on the other hand, you know, the economy was doing worse, and a lot of people asked, you know, what was the point of all this? And so, you know, it's hard to judge.
Saeed, are people asking what was the point of all this? Is there, and the big question, of course, will Islamists come to power and end up restricting the very freedoms that people were hoping to achieve?
Actually, it's very possible, but I'm still saying that there is no other way other than democracy. Islamists are using religion as an instrument. So some people think that religion is driving politics in these groups, but it is not the truth as I see it. They are political groups using religion as an instrument to gain political power. And we cannot just generalize. Like, some people think Islamists are Islamists, but Muslim brothers are completely different from Salafists. And I think the main problem lies in looking at Islam itself as one thing. Islam is a religion and is also a political system. And Islam as a religion, it is valid for all times, as any other religion, all places. But as a political system, no one has the courage to say and to face Muslim brothers and those Islamists and say this political system is invalid in this time.
I think what many people are hoping for outside of the region is that if you're going to have Islamists coming into power, it's political Islam, that you're going to have a moderate, at least a moderate form of it. Perhaps the Muslim Brotherhood would be considered a moderate form of it that may not restrict freedoms and still continue to allow democracy.
But are they moderate until they gain full power and then start coming up with their agendas? This is the question.
So there is a fear there. Do you think it could undermine the development? Could we be seeing a lot more violence in the region?
Or these themselves will have to develop. Actually, we have seen it. Even the most conservative, orthodox Salafist, for example, their attitude to alcohol. They have said, we will ban alcohol from everywhere. No one will be allowed to drink in Egypt. But just a few days ago, Al-Noor, the main Salafist party, said, actually, it is not a big deal if tourists will bring their liquor and alcohol with them. So they will be facing some realities. And this is a big challenge, because they are being very closed to the interpretation of this holy text that has been done since hundreds of years. I think Islam, to survive as a political system, needs new interpretation, needs new school of thinking, and as a religion, it's open for this, but some people, they don't really have the courage to talk about it.
I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap this up. Just a final word from you, Ulrike, on this subject. When Europe looks at North Africa and the Middle East right now, kind of in turmoil, do they see a Pandora's box, or do they see it heading in the right direction?
Well, the question will be, just as Mr. Kulisch said, whether there will be economic development. If not, you will have a turmoil there. If you somehow manage to generate employment, especially for the young people, I think the way to democracy is without alternative.
And finally, Nicholas, I know you also covered the Iraq war. You spent some time in the Middle East. I'm wondering, what does this mean for the region as a whole? Will it increase tensions, and vis-a-vis Israel in particular? Is this a security problem?
Well, I mean, I think when you have such an overwhelming majority of people in Egypt who disagree with Israel's policies, you're going to have a problem.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to cut it short. That's all we have time for. Samir Said, Ulrike Herrmann, and Nicholas Kulisch, thank you for being with us. Thank you all for joining us here on DW TV. Do tune in again next week. Check us out on dwworld.de.